One of the most amazing experiences that I can recall was a visit I made to the Sistine Chapel in Rome in 1987. It was my great privilege to see the chapel's magnificent ceiling when it was almost exactly halfway restored. A before and after effect, if you will. One half of the ceiling was impressive in its own way. Clearly the work of a master artist. It was stark and dark and dramatic. One could readily see why entire art history treatises had been written on Michelangelo's brilliant use of muted grayscale color and dramatic shadowing. But the ceiling those treatises describe was a fiction that barely resembled the artist's original work. Once centuries of accumulated gunk and gack had been cleaned away, the residues of incense and air pollution and candle smoke, it was clear that the master artist had painted vividly and vibrantly with bright apple greens and fiery oranges and reds, deep blues and warm, rich yellows, colors that all but leap from the ceiling. The darkly dramatic ceiling described by the textbooks was striking, even moving. But the restored ceiling was alive. All in all, the Sistine Chapel's ceiling is a fascinating study in how prevailing understandings accumulated over time, like Michelangelo, the great grayscale genius, can obscure vibrant truths that lie beneath. It all reminds me a little bit of what we have done with Mary, the mother of Jesus. For many of us, the Mary that comes to mind is the image that we've seen depicted all our lives. Gentle Mary, meek and mild. Mary the kind. Mary the obedient. Mary the faithful. Mary the virginal. Clothed in an always blue cloak demurely draped across her head and shoulders, her eyes glancing sideways and downward in humility and holiness, her face bathed in an aura of light, the image is iconic. Mary's brand. If you see a picture of Mary, you know it's Mary because of the features I've just described. If you asked me to draw a picture of Mary, it's what I'd probably draw. So Mary becomes for us what we've imagined her to be. And then, with that imagined depiction in mind, we go back and we read the biblical text. And the phrases that jump out at us the most are, of course, the ones that fit that depiction, that brand. Here I am, a servant of the Lord. Let it be with me according to your word. Obedience. He has looked with favor upon the lowliness of his servant. Humility. From now on, all generations will call me blessed. Holiness. Mary's speech, or the way we hear Mary speak, is impacted by the Mary we think we know. The Mary who, I suspect, has become muted, much like the Sistine Chapel ceiling. But let's rub away a bit of that veneer and reconsider Mary. Of course, we know very little, so we must engage in some educated speculation. But we do know that she's from Nazareth, which means with near certainty, Mary is poor. Like probably peasant poor. The Nazareth of today is a bustling city of almost 80,000 people. But the Nazareth of Mary's day, well, a perusal of internet archaeology articles estimates a town of perhaps 400 residents, many of them related in close family groupings, living in an economy of subsistence farming, shepherding, and stonecraft, working with the area's soft limestone. Not much wealth to be had in Nazareth, in other words. The building, the economic hustle and bustle, would have been in Sepphoris, about 8 miles away geographically, but a world away economically. The Herodian rulers set out to make Sepphoris the ornament of Galilee, a thriving, cultured city, thoroughly loyal to Rome. It was a city of affluence with a 4,000-seat Roman theater. 10 times the entire population of Nazareth could be seated in that theater. And the theater was built into the side of the hill. The money for such expansive and expensive endeavors would have come from taxes. And the taxes would have come from the poor subsistence families of the surrounding region. The wealth of the city extracted from the poverty of the countryside. In broad strokes, the picture would have been wealth, power, status, such as it was, in Sepphoris. And Nazareth? It wasn't even on the main road. An afterthought and a backwater. In the Gospel of John, when Nathanael is first told of Jesus, he says, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" And the answer Nathanael imagines, of course, is no. Nazareth is nowhere, which makes Mary nobody from nowhere. And not to belabor the point too much, the economy of the first century was an economy largely rigged for the poor to stay poor. It was hard to get ahead. A subsistence farmer who had a bad crop, a dry season, for example, might have to borrow money to even have a crop the next year, or might find himself in arrears on his taxes, might even lose his land and have to farm it as a tenant of the new absentee owner. The rich got richer, and the poor got left behind, left out, forgotten. Poor women, poor widows, poor orphans, they were just bones to be chewed in that economy. So if God were picking a place for God's Son to be born, and a mother to be the Theotokos, the God-bearer, Nazareth and Mary would seem the unlikeliest of options. So that bit of informed imagination leads me to hear Mary's Magnificat quite differently. Not as a song of reverent deference or meekness, but as a song of empowerment, of astonishment, a song of arrival. Mary, who is nobody from nowhere, has been seen by God, chosen and called by God. We can hear the fierce joy of the song. My soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior, my deliverer, the one who has lifted me up, for he has looked with favor upon the lowliness of his servant. Lowliness here does not mean humility. My Greek translation texts render the word as humiliation. Humiliation is not something that one does to oneself. To be humiliated is to be systematically suppressed, repressed, oppressed, put down, pushed down. God has looked with favor upon one that the world wouldn't even see. When Mary speaks of her own lowliness, it's the same term that she uses a few verses later when she speaks of the rich and powerful being brought down and the poor and the lowly being lifted up. The mighty one has done great things for me, and holy is his name, Mary cries. And then she goes on to enlarge upon her own experience. God has shown strength with his arm. He has scattered the proud in the thoughts of their hearts. He has brought down the powerful from their thrones. He has lifted up the lowly and the humiliated. He has filled the hungry with good things. And Mary speaks of these actions as already accomplished, an unavoidable certainty, and historical inevitability. Why? I know for certain that God has seen the poor because God has seen me, Mary is saying. And my empowerment is the empowerment of women everywhere and in every time. And my salvation is the salvation of all the poor. Magnificat is a liberation song of ecstatic certainty. Mary understands herself as the beginning place of God's new thing, and God's new thing, especially in Luke's gospel, as we will find in our congregation-wide study beginning in January, is the lifting up and the humanizing of the poor. Magnificat. Mary's song and our text for this morning is like the overture for Luke's gospel. It sounds all of the notes and expounds all of the themes that will be repeated throughout. It prepares the audience for what is to come. Thus we see in Jesus' first recorded teaching in Luke chapter 4, he lifts up this Isaiah text. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, which was understood to be the Jubilee year, the cancellation of all debts, the great leveling of everything. Now, a word about Luke. When Luke speaks of bringing down the rich and lifting up the poor, he isn't proclaiming some sort of cosmic comeuppance in which the haves become the have-nots and the have-nots become the haves. That would eventuate in the same system with different faces. A new set of top dogs and underdogs, but the system is the same as it ever was. That isn't what Luke lifts up, and it isn't what Jesus proclaims. If we want a glimpse of what Luke envisions, we can look ahead to the book of Acts, also believed to have been written by Luke. In the second chapter of Acts, Luke speaks of the community of Christ's followers. Awe and wonder came upon everyone because many signs and wonders were being done by the apostles. All who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. Day by day, as they spent much time together in the temple, they broke bread at home and ate their food with glad and generous hearts, with glad and generous hearts, with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having the goodwill of all the people. And day by day, the Lord added to their number those who were being saved. What Luke describes here in the beginning of Acts is the human economic version of the peaceable kingdom, where there are no predators and prey, no haves and have-nots, no seen and unseen, but wolves and lambs lie down together, and the needs of the have-nots find fulfillment in the shared abundance of the haves. Shared abundance, I suggest, is more like parity than charity. More like parity. Charity. Remember what Mary proclaims. He has brought down the powerful and lifted up the lowly, a leveling of the playing field. Now, if one is poor, that is good news indeed. But if one is privileged, like I am privileged. Well, it begins to sound a bit like resource reallocation. And am I so very sure that I want to share all things in common? Share my hard-earned things? Genuinely and equitably share? That sounds challenging and uncomfortable. The Magnificat is dangerous speech that verges into dangerous territory. And Mary is the fierce and God-seen prophet who voices it. With a mom like that, no wonder Jesus had an edge to him. Neither Jesus nor his mother seem to have been about minor adjustments and small repairs. So here's the question. If all of that, or some of that, is true, and it sounds true to me, then why hasn't the certainty that Mary proclaimed as already having been accomplished yet been seen? Well, if something is dangerous and subversive, you silence it. A quote here from an internet source referenced in a 2018 Washington Post article. During the British rule of India, the Magnificat was prohibited from being sung in church. In the 1980s, Guatemala's government discovered Mary's words about God's preferential love for the poor to be too dangerous and revolutionary. The song had been creating quite the stirring among Guatemala's impoverished masses. Mary's words were inspiring the Guatemalan poor to believe that change was indeed possible. Thus, their government banned any public recitation of Mary's words. Similarly, after the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, whose children all disappeared during the Dirty War, placed the Magnificat's words on posters throughout the Capitol Plaza, the military junta of Argentina outlawed any public display of Mary's song. The German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer recognized the revolutionary nature of Mary's song. Before being executed by the Nazis, Bonhoeffer spoke these words in a sermon during Advent 1933. He said, "The Song of Mary is the oldest Advent hymn. It is at once the most passionate, the wildest, one might even say the most revolutionary Advent hymn ever sung. This is not the gentle, tender, dreamy Mary whom we sometimes see in paintings. This song has none of the sweet, nostalgic, or even playful tones of some of our Christmas carols. It is instead a hard, strong, inexorable song about the power of God, the powerlessness of humankind." If you truly want to silence a dangerous song, the best way to do it is to silence the original singer. And the most effective way to do that, if she's no longer among you, is to sanctify her. Make her meek and mild, gentle, obedient, radiant, virginal, submissive, and pure. Model for all the generations. Cover over her bold and fiery color with an accumulated patina of piety. Don't paint her out of the picture. Just mute her. Soon enough, the original is all but unrecognizable, and the Magnificat becomes not a world-altering proclamation, but a grayscale serving suggestion. Your results may vary. sometimes. And perhaps today, a little bit of that accumulated buildup can be rubbed away. We can see Mary's true colors shining through. Hear her bold, brave song with fresh ears, and dream of a world where the poor aren't, and the rich aren't, and the wolf and the lamb aren't predator and prey, and the kingdom indeed and at last is at hand. It at least reminds us of what we're called to wait for and to work for. A world made altogether new.